Jay Therappel, thank you very much for accepting my invitation. It's a really pleasure to have you on Syriana Analysis. This is your first appearance on my channel, and I'm sure it's not going to be the last. We need to discuss today about the Taliban. I think we have relatively different opinions on the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. If I'm not mistaken, you believe the Taliban has changed, or the Islamist organization now follows a realistic approach. How did you come to this conclusion, and why should we even trust the claims of the Taliban that it has changed?
I'm just observing what everyone else is observing, which is that the Taliban have been making statements suggesting that they're different now than what they were back when they were deposed by the U.S. invasion in 2001. So just to go over them, I mean, the Taliban have promised no revenge against collaborators. They admitted to making mistakes that helped the occupation, which shows some capacity for self-criticism. They promised to end the production of opium. They promised not to host militants hostile to neighboring countries, which is what India, Russia, China, Iran, and Syria would certainly be at least relieved to hear. They say that the hijab is mandatory, but not the burqa, which is the cloth that covers a woman's face. And on top of that, they say that they support women's rights so long as it's within the limitations of Islam. So only time will really tell whether they live up to these promises. But I think it's worth acknowledging why the Taliban has gained the trust of Russia, Iran, China, and that's because these countries, they don't support the Taliban takeover as much as they support the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. So this has been a major change, the major change over the past 5 to 6 years. I believe, and I'm sure we can agree on this, that the US is a destabilizing force. All the countries in the region, I'm pretty sure, know that. The only difference is that some countries like, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, they've collaborated with this policy of destabilization because they think it's in their interests. But then there are you've got the other countries that have resisted this destabilization, or they've been negatively affected by it. So Russia, Iran, China, they've been negatively affected, and they're not collaborating with the destabilization.
Jay, what you said is really, really accurate. Your assessment of the situation in Afghanistan, it's coming also from the statements of Taliban. And there is a big focus now on also women's rights. It's regardless, like we know that the American and the Western mainstream media are hypocrites. They're talking about women's rights, and they didn't do much or sometimes nothing for women's rights, not only in Afghanistan, but the entire Middle East. They claim that they champion women's rights, but they are exporting some neoliberal ideologies through the feminist organizations or these NGOs. However, as much as I hate this hypocrisy of the US and its allies in the region, but don't you think at least the Afghan women, they deserve better than the Taliban? I mean, you already said that they will enforce women to wear hijab. At the same time, they say hijab is a choice. So women, they don't have a choice. This is number one. Number two, they're gonna treat women as second-class citizen. Like they say, we will treat women, or we will give rights to women according to the Sharia or to Islam. And we all know that the Islam could be interpreted the way you want. Like if you read the different versions, if you read from different languages, if you hear two different clerics for the same hadith or for the same verse from Quran, two different people will they will explain it in different way. So why would I trust the Taliban or their interpretation when it comes to women's rights and human rights in general in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, look, in an ideal world, the socialist government of Afghanistan would not have been overthrown, and the state of women and the status of women in Afghanistan would be much better. It would probably be somewhere like where the status of women in Syria before the war began in 2011. So when the socialists were in power, I mean, 15,000 women served in the Afghan army. Women made up 40% of the doctors and 60% of the teachers at Kabul University. A lot of that was made possible because of Soviet assistance. And so from 1929 to 1979, when Afghanistan was at peace, the biggest source of economic assistance was from the Soviet Union, which built roads, electrical power stations, irrigation canals, factories, you name it. And of course, the United States also provided economic assistance so they could compete for influence with the USSR. So most of that social progress, and this is the point that I wanted to get to, was wiped out as a consequence of the socialist government of President Mohammad Najibullah being overthrown in 1992. And that was thanks to the betrayal of Abdurrashid Dostum, who is the leading army general of the socialist government. Dostum then joined forces with the Mujahideen commander Ahmed Shah Massoud to form the Northern Alliance. And they went to war against the other Mujahideen factions led by Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. And in the process, Kabul was completely destroyed and decades of economic progress was wiped out. So it's because these Mujahideen warlords were so corrupt and lawless that people welcomed the Taliban in 1995 to begin with. And that's because they were at least bringing some kind of order to the place. You know, they were executing criminals, including by hacking off limbs and things like that. So these were all, you know, this was a time when there was horrific crimes being committed against women, which is bound to make any society more conservative. So women started covering themselves because they didn't want to attract male attention, especially in that kind of a horrific civil war climate when there's so much, you know, violence against women going on. So the Taliban were a product of these terrible conditions, and that should ultimately be blamed, in my opinion, on Pakistan, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. So the only way women's rights could have improved under the US occupation was if the US was actually motivated to develop Afghanistan the way that the Soviet Union actually did. Now, the US spent $2 trillion on Afghanistan, and what do they have to show for it? Gender inequality, 157. So it's the sixth worst in the world. Maternal mortality rate, 9th worst in the world. The average age of schooling for girls is like the 7th worst in the world. And, you know, 33% of the population currently is food insecure, according to the United Nations. So what can we draw from this? The United States was never interested in helping to educate Afghan women or even to alleviate poverty. All they did was turn the country into one gigantic opium plantation to generate revenues for the black budgets of the CIA and Turkish intelligence to fund groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS across the Arab world. So I just wanted to finish on this point. Here's the contradiction. On the one extreme, the US invades Afghanistan claiming they want to change the social values of that society. But in fact, they actually, what they're doing is actually keeping the country poor. But on the other hand, China says that it wants to work with the Taliban to develop the country's economic infrastructure, which I believe will actually do more to change the conditions that created the misogyny of the Taliban to begin with. So if you keep a country backward, then even the resistance against you will embody backward social values. So to answer your question, the only way the rights of women can improve is if neighboring states commit to economically developing Afghanistan.
But do you think that's going to happen with these powers weighing in more, like China and Russia and India and even Iran?
I think the difference now is that, you know, these countries are not backing different sides. Like throughout the 1990s, the reason there was a civil war is because on the one hand, Russia, India, Iran, Turkey, and also the Central Asian countries, right? So Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, they were all backing the Northern Alliance, and the Taliban was being supported by Pakistan and Saudi Arabia. And so because the major Eurasian powers were backing different sides, the recipe for a civil war was there, you know.
Yeah.
Whereas now Russia, China, Iran are all saying we're content to work with the Taliban. But that's not to say that, you know, civil war tendencies aren't possible, but it's just less likely now than what it was in the 90s.
Jay, you mentioned also the issue of the opium, which is extremely important because some people underestimate this issue. Now, under the occupation of the US, the business of opium has, I mean, dramatically improved, right? Now, according to the head of Russia's anti-drug agency, Viktor Ivanov, he says trafficking opium into Europe was a major source of revenue for ISIS. and he named Turkey as a transit country. Now, given that Turkey has a history of supporting ISIS and other terrorist groups, how can we be sure that the Taliban won't trade the opium of Afghanistan or give special treatment to Erdogan's Turkey or even Qatar? Then these two both countries, Doha and Qatar, they enjoy good relations with the Taliban, right?
Well, the Taliban have publicly stated that they don't want Afghanistan to continue being a narco state, and that they want to crack down on opium production, and that they need international help to diversify their agrarian sector as well. I think it's important to remember here that the Taliban actually does have a pretty good track record of living up to these promises. In 2000, they banned the growing of opium. They said it was un-Islamic, and that caused the production to fall by over 90% in 1 year. They also have an interest in banning opium, and that's because it displaces the production of food crop, which then affects the poor and the working classes, many of whom support the Taliban, because they see the Taliban as being less corrupt than the former government of Ashraf Ghani. I mean, let's remember 33% of Afghanistan, after $2 trillion being spent by the United States in Afghanistan, is food insecure. So to be sure, throughout the occupation, the Taliban did generate revenues from opium, mostly through taxing farmers under their control. But that's because they didn't have any power, and they needed money to fund their resistance against the occupation. So they didn't have political power, so they needed opium to fund their fight against the government. But now that they do have power, I'd say that they have an interest in growing food as a means of maintaining support from the people. So to answer your question, I think the Taliban does actually have a genuine interest in at least gradually weaning Afghanistan off opium and diversifying the economy with help from regional powers again.
I'm a little bit skeptical about this. You know why? Because especially in the Islamic world, it's un-Islamic to trade with opium, right? But there are also some fatwas coming from certain clerics that they permit selling opium or drugs to the enemies because they say we want to sink them, or we want to spread, let's say, corruption, social corruption among the society.
Yeah.
So this could
I
be
think
one
it's
of
the
the points
distinction
that...
between Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. It's like our areas of control are Dar al-Islam. Everything beyond that is Dar al-Harb.
Yes.
And therefore it's okay to attack your enemy with opium and things like that.
Yeah, just for the audience to know, Dar al-Harb is the house of war, right? Like when you're in war,
yeah, the realm of warfare. Yeah,
exactly. And there is also another important point, which is ISIS, and I think it's an elephant in the room that we need to discuss. Now, despite the Taliban's execution of the leader of ISIS in Afghanistan, Abu Omar al-Khorasani, news reports came out saying that the Taliban had released ISIS fighters recently. Now, why would I or others buy the claim that the Taliban abandoned terrorism for good? I mean, let's remember that Al-Nusra Front today also rebranded itself, and it claims to fight ISIS too. And it says that our struggle is not trans-border or transnational struggle. It's only limited for Syria, and we are abandoning terrorism. And this leader of Al-Nusra is wearing a suit, and he shaved or trimmed his beard a little bit, and he's giving some, let's say, impressions or sending signals to the outside world that we are also good guys now. I mean, what makes the Taliban any different from Al-Nusra?
I think the major difference is that the Taliban is 100% Afghan. I mean, to the extent that the Taliban in Afghanistan has foreign fighters on its side, they'd probably be Pashtuns from Pakistan, because Pakistan has a population of Pashtuns that are about 2 to 3 times larger than the Pashtun population in Afghanistan. But that's about it. Other than that, they don't really rely on foreign fighters at all. Whereas, in Syria, I mean, I'm sure you know this better than me. I mean, I think 50 to 70% of the dead among the insurgency were foreigners at one stage, and that's according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. I can pull up the data. But I think also the reason why Al-Nusra, to bring up your example, the reason they rebranded is because they were being targeted by the Russian Air Force. And so they disaffiliated from Al-Qaeda so that the US could say that they were moderate rebels to shield them from Russian airstrikes. And the reason they split from ISIS was simply because there was a leadership struggle between Baghdadi and Jalani. But there's still a lot of foreigners in Jabhat al-Nusra. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Abdullah Muhaisini is a Saudi, correct?
Yes, he's Saudi.
Yeah. So that's, I think, the huge difference. I think we should draw a distinction between globalist and nationalist Islamic movements. I mean, on the one hand, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is, Al-Qaeda, and Islamic State, they have a global agenda, whereas the Taliban over the past 5 to 6 years, they've maintained that they just care about controlling Afghanistan. And that's a huge difference for countries like Russia, China, Iran, and India. You mentioned terrorism. If terrorism means targeting civilians or non-military targets to achieve political objectives, then yes, the Taliban certainly has engaged in terrorism. I want to get that on the record. But over the past 5 to 6 years, the worst terrorist atrocities have been by Islamic State, which the Taliban have been fighting since 2015. And if you have a close look at the attacks that the Taliban claimed responsibility for over the past 20 years, they've been against, civilian officials from the former US-backed Afghan government. They've been against, civilians working in embassies of governments that the Taliban considers to be allies of the US. So, for example, the Indian embassy has been targeted by the Taliban. The end goal of Taliban terrorism has been to weaken the government, and I do call it terrorism. However, when it comes to the deliberate, targeting of Afghan civilians for their religious identity, I mean, these have been carried out overwhelmingly by Islamic State over the past 5 to 6 years. So, in July 2016, when there was a bombing that killed 100 Hazara Shias, it was claimed by Islamic State, whereas the Taliban condemned the attack and they said that it was a plot to ignite a civil war. So the fact that the Taliban has been at war with Islamic State since 2015 means that it shares a common interest with the other countries that have a genuine interest in defeating Islamic State. And I stress genuine because, the US says that they fought Islamic State, but I'd say that the only reason they did that is because they wanted to occupy northern Syria on behalf of the Kurdish separatists who are their collaborators.
The thing is, every time the Americans engage in a war against terrorism spreads more and more. Like, they give you the impression that they are actually sanctioning the real forces that they are fighting terrorism in the Middle East, and they're harboring terrorism, and directly or indirectly. And the proof of that is what John Kerry said, I think in 2015 or late 2015 or early 2016, when he was in a secret meeting with opposition figures from Syria, and his audio conversation was leaked, that they were monitoring the advance of ISIS from Palmyra to Damascus, and they were happy watching ISIS advance in order to practice pressure on President Assad and force him to compromise. So even if the Americans aren't supporting ISIS directly, but they're not taking action when they can, when their satellites are there, and Obama declared his US-led war against terror, right? And they were conducting airstrikes from time to time, but they didn't. Their inaction also in Syria, it led to the expansion of ISIS into 70% of the Syrian territories.
Also, just to add to that, I mean, in the year that the US was bombing Syria and the Russians weren't, so from September 2014 to September 2015, the Syrian government actually lost territory to Islamic State, because from an ISIS point of view, why would you fight against the United States when you can fight against the Syrian government? It actually just directed Daesh aggression in the direction of the Syrian government. So I think that was purely strategic from an American point of view.
Exactly, and they were successful in this. Unfortunately, we haven't read this or we didn't calculate it right at that time, but thankfully, after the intervention of the allies and with the steadfastness of the Syrian army, the tides have turned upside down. Now, this is a question that I'm circulating in my mind, because I saw this Bernard Henry Levy in BHL in Afghanistan, and he's like, I'm going to support the Taliban resistance against, the Afghan resistance against the Taliban. I mean, do you agree with me that he is there the BHL is in Afghanistan to support a mercenary militant force against the Taliban in order to recreate mayhem and hence destabilize Central Asia, which is extremely important sphere of influence for Russia and China. Let's remember it's on the southern belt of Russia and also on the Silk Road.
I agree that that's what he wants, but it's not really possible without the collaboration and cooperation of Tajikistan. So it looks like Bernard Henri Levy is supporting the forces of Ahmed Massoud. So for those who don't know, Ahmed Massoud is the son of Ahmed Shah Massoud, who's known. He was one of the major Mujahideen commanders against the socialist Soviet-backed government in the 1980s, and he's now being supported by Tajikistan, which then also raises the possibility that India could start working with Tajikistan. As they did in the 1990s to support the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. So when Ahmed Shah Massoud was assassinated, and when he was dying, he was actually airlifted to an Indian field hospital that was located in Tajikistan. So I think maybe that's the strategy now, because the other countries in the region that I mentioned, Russia, China, Iran, of course, Pakistan's always supported the Afghan Taliban. These countries, they just want stability in Afghanistan. They just want one side to win. They don't want a civil war. They want stability. Whereas France, the United States, yeah, I can see them certainly supporting the people in the Panjshir Valley, because there's a kind of geographic factor about Afghanistan, which is that, north of Kabul, there's this place called the Panjshir Valley, and it's basically a fortress. It's just surrounded by very high mountains, and inside you've got this very beautiful valley, actually. And so it's possible to hold out from any government that takes control over Kabul, but also to launch offensives to take Kabul as well. So during the civil war in the 1990s, the Panjshir Valley was like the stronghold of the Northern Alliance, and they used that as their base of operations to try and take Kabul, but then Kabul was destroyed in the process. So I think, yeah, there's probably thinking along those lines to think, well, maybe we can continue create another Afghan civil war. But as I said before, the other powers in the region don't want it.
Excuse my ignorance about this. Is Tajikistan a sphere of influence for the United States? Is it like a satellite state for the US, or it's neutral in this?
I don't think it needs to be a satellite of the United States. I'm not too sure about about to what extent it's friendly to the United States as opposed to Russia and the other powers. I'm guessing that that it just wants to kind of cut deals with everyone and be friendly with everyone.
Self-interest.
But I think it's self-interest, but I think it's more importantly that, like, a significant percentage, like 20, 25, some say up to 30% of Afghanistan's population is Tajik. So it's like a kind of direct ethnic border there, because if you look at Afghanistan, it's like, look at the ethnic groups that you have there. You have the Pashtuns. Well, there's 2 to 3 times as many Pashtuns in Pakistan. Then you've got the Uzbeks, which is like, there's Uzbekistan right next door. There's the Turkmen, there's Turkmenistan right next door. And then you've got the Tajiks, who are the second largest ethnic group. And right next door, you have Tajikistan. And then you've got the Hazaras who are in central Afghanistan, and they're Shias. And so their kind of theological, friends are in Iran.
Are they 12ers?
So it's like the conditions have always been there for a very complicated.
The Shias in Afghanistan, are they 12ers? The Shia in Afghanistan.
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Yes, they're Athnashiri. Yeah.
Okay, so we come to the last question, which is more speculation, but I think you're following the situation in Afghanistan better than I do. Do you think it will end up in a more, let's say, relative stability or destructive chaos? You already mentioned that the neighboring countries aren't interested in a civil war or destabilization of Afghanistan, but we always have to keep all the options on the table. So do you see some powers would succeed in destabilizing Afghanistan again in order to create some sort of, I don't want to say a regional war, but it could be a spot of a hotspot in Central Asia?
Not as much, like for the reasons that I mentioned before. So Uzbekistan, so if we look at like the three stans, that neighbor Afghanistan to the north, the former Soviet countries, Uzbekistan has actually returned Afghan refugees, because politically, if you have refugees coming in from another country and there's a kind of possibility of a civil war, then there's always the worry that that this can lead to tensions and the fear that they might be fomenting an armed rebellion. It's like, for example, the Syrian refugees in Turkey. The reason why Syria is worried about that population is because they can always be mobilized. Refugee populations have always been kind of sought after to wage wars in other countries. Turkmenistan has actually accepted the Taliban takeover, and they actually have another interest in this because there's a pipeline that runs from Turkmenistan. So the gas is from the Caspian Sea. It's called the TAPI pipeline. So it's Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And so there's actually kind of an interest in these four countries, stabilizing the region because they have an economic interest. I mean, they want income, they want money. So that's another stabilizing factor, I'd say. And these factors didn't exist back in the 1980s. These are recent developments that go along with the process of Eurasian integration. It goes along with the Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese are pouring in a lot of investment. They've promised, I think, 400 billion, I think, to invest in Iran. And of course, this is like an infrastructure project that has Afghanistan right in the middle. So the only country out of those three, former Soviet republics that I mentioned that actually seems to be, fomenting a civil war is Tajikistan. So I can predict, if I had to predict, I'd say, okay, well, Tajikistan and India would probably try and keep a civil war going against the Taliban. India really doesn't like the Taliban, and it's for reasons that are understandable if you look at the history. I mean, the Taliban has hijacked, Indian Airlines planes. Well, they've been responsible for associating with the hijackers. So yeah, I mean, those two countries have an interest in keeping it going, but the other countries in the region just want stability, and they just want the Taliban to mind their own business and not allow Afghan soil to be used against other countries.
Actually, about the refugees, this is another point of hypocrisy that I'm sure you're also reading all these tweets and reportages on Twitter and on mainstream media. It's like everyone now, it's like not everyone, of course, those who are behind these strong media outlets and the algorithms that they push on social media, all of a sudden, everyone cares about the refugees coming from Afghanistan after the takeover, Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. Where the fact is, it's been 20 years of war on Afghanistan and on the Afghan people. And seriously, in the past 20 years, how many demos were organized in Western countries in favor of the Afghan people? How many times the people tried to help the Afghan people? And now we see all these pictures. American troops are holding babies. We don't know if they kidnap these babies or how do they bring these babies, and they show them as if they are like a kindergarten or they're like some sort of a kid hospital, And nobody mentions the brutality of the US and how they went door by door to humiliate the Afghan people. They murdered underage people, and all these are documented with pictures and videos, and they were proud of taking these photos and pictures, just like ISIS was proud of posting their horrendous crimes on social media. They were not only killing the Afghan people. I just recently watched a video of how they murdered a dog in Afghanistan. It's a heartless people just going and practicing their sadism on the Afghan people. We, of course, we all disagree. I come from Syria. I have Armenian origins. If I sit with an Afghan person, there could be 120, maybe 20 degrees differences in our opinions, right? But these people are human and they deserve dignity. And what the United States did in the past 20 years, they humiliated the Afghan people. And they shouldn't be surprised if the Afghan people prefer the Taliban over the US at the end of the day. Of course, Taliban is an Afghani force. It's not like coming from the space, right? Or it's not an alien force in Afghanistan. So as much as I hate, of course, any radical religious group to come to power, but at the same time, we also despise this American foreign policy, which I truly hope that in the coming weeks or months, there would be more withdrawal of US forces. It's counterproductive for the US domestic interests. I'm talking about the American people now, not the corporations who made billions from Afghanistan. And it's counterproductive for us. And at the end of the day, they're not securing their national security, and we're not able to rebuild our nations and to be part of the civilization again, just because there is a very big bulldog in the region that is scaring everyone and dictating them what to do. And now if people want to invest in Syria, the US is raising the finger, like even for private companies. I heard also from some sources that Biden is going to withdraw its forces from Syria and he's going to reverse the US policy. Let's hope that's true. But after what? Like after 11 years of war and destruction? And what has the United States achieved in Syria? What was the strategic goal? When we say strategic or geopolitical goal, there should be some like geographical, like when you send boots on the ground in certain location, you should achieve concrete and tangible goals. And the US forces underground in Syria, they're not achieving any tangible goals except two things. One, they are looting the oil, which they don't need, right? And two, they're just putting stick or in the wheel of the reconstruction. That's not a strategy. A strategy means like you go to war in a certain place, and after 5 or 10 years, you achieve 1, 2, 3, and 4 goals, and not to stop your enemies or foes from achieving their own goal. Knowing that Syria is a Syrian land, not even an American land, right? And it's also, there is a very big elephant in the room here, which is Israel. And people do not want to admit that the US has gone into wars for Israel. And
totally.
not because of the American interest, because Israel doesn't want to invade Syria, because it knows its invasion will create a regional war, and Iran will intervene, Syria will intervene, and the resistance will intervene against it. So the intervention of the US will keep this conflict on a higher level, which is the US and Russia trying to debalance this conflict in the Middle East. But let's hope. I mean, we always say let's hope for the best. And for the Americans who are watching this, I mean, we don't hate the American people, but at the end of the day, we have become, at least I have become also a refugee because of your administration's war on Syria, right? Our future was demolished. Our shops were destroyed. Everything has gone. Our memories in Syria. So we don't wish you also to live such horrendous experiences. Nobody should live such experiences, and because of a few corporations, especially in the military-industrial complex, that have made billions and billions from our suffering. You're going to war to guard the opium farms in Afghanistan, and your army is guarding the oil fields in Syria, not to protect them, but to loot them. There's a big difference, like because the American journalists, they come to Syria and they take some selfies with US forces, posting on Twitter, they say, a selfie with an American forces protecting the oil fields. Protecting from who? Exactly. From the Syrian people or what?
And it's causing inflation, and it's just awful what's being done there. But also, I wanted to touch on a few things. In many ways, the refugee policies that the European Union has implemented is largely a part of the imperial geostrategy. I call it just, invade and invite, basically. So you destroy a country. Like if we assume that the end goal for Syria, from the American point of view, is to make the region, better for Israel, because let's say the long-term strategy for Israel is to completely destroy these countries, Lebanon, Syria, to the point where the governments collapse, and then they can march in, take more land, create, puppet states, and then, expand. If that's the Israeli agenda, which is to ultimately expand, then what better way of doing it than to depopulate these regions, right? By basically going to the Europeans and saying, look, you need to open your borders and let in all of these refugees. If you don't, then you're racist. And then, what happens, right? Like a large number of people basically leave their homelands, and that ends up serving the interests of Israel.
Jay, you are a person of color. You're not white, but even though if you say this, even though if you say this in Germany or in other European countries, they would call you a fascist, they would call you a neo-Nazi, just because you pointed out for an important fact that these refugees are also they marched into Europe because of the wars that their governments triggered in the region, right? It's not like in the morning they woke up and they say, I want to become a refugee. There was a brutal war on Syria, and up till this moment, they call it civil war. They call it Assad is killing his own people. They don't want to admit that their governments still, they are playing a destructive role in Syria, and they're causing this refugee crisis. Stop the intervention in our region. There won't be any, let's say, refugees in your countries. And this is one of the reasons why the far-right groups are like gaining momentum, especially in the European countries. And
I mean, nobody likes mass immigration, right? Like no person on earth wants like a sudden influx of people from another part of the world. It's just nobody wants that, right? Like
it's crazy. Jay, it was a really, really interesting chat with you. We touched, I think, a lot of things that we needed to discuss about the Taliban. And if new things occur about this case or in other cases, especially regarding Central Asia, we will discuss together again on Syriana analysis. And guys, go and follow Jay. I will put his social media links in the description below. He's a really clever and intellectual guy. He writes, you write mostly on Facebook. You're not, I don't see you too active on Twitter, right?
I have a website called theorientaldespot.com. So I put stuff up there, but right now I'm committed to finishing my PhD, hopefully.
All the luck, my friend. I will post your also website and your social media accounts in the description below. Guys, thank you very much for watching and see you next time.